A while back, I did a video on how to get the most realistic looking textures using Infinite Painter on an Android tablet. Today I want to show you a nice little trick that might help you get the best looking textures using Rebelle 7 on a PC or Mac. I'm going to show you how to create a texture overlay based on your painting that will enhance the sense of depth and texture. My name's Pete. Welcome to Basement Picasso. So to do this, you're going to need a copy of Rebelle 7 by Escape Motions, and it'll need to be the Pro version as we're going to use the Nanopixel export as part of the process. There are quite a few steps to the process, although it doesn't actually take long once you get the hang of it. So I'll run through the steps first, and then I'll show you in a bit more detail. What we're going to do is take a finished painting that we want to enhance the texture of. We will add a neutral grey layer to make the overlay, and then save a temporary copy of the file that we can use to make that overlay. We'll reduce the image pixel size down, and then we will use the Nanopixel export to save out the overlay texture. We'll then reopen the original file and import the overlay texture, and finally process it to remove the glossy highlights. The final result will be a high resolution file with deeper, more pronounced textures. So why would you want to do this? Well, in Rebelle, when you use impasto brushes, the shadow that makes the impasto feel three-dimensional is pixel based. And that means it looks good for low resolution images. If I paint on an image that is, say, 1000 by 1000 pixels, the texture seems to be thick and convincing. But if I work on an image that is 4 times the size and then make the brush 4 times bigger to get the same effect of stroke, then the texture seems to be much less pronounced. It is like the paint is a quarter of the thickness. It has lost that appealing, textured, chunky look. Now, if you have the Pro version of Rebelle, then you can use Nanopixel export to upscale your lower resolution image. And that works extremely well with two-dimensional pictures and with paper and canvas textures. But Nanopixel has a couple of small issues for thicker paint. Impasto can sometimes look blocky or pixelated when upscaled, but the main problem for me is gloss. Enabling Nanopixel disables the gloss slider. It has a baked-in gloss value of about 5. And for a lot of the work that I do, it makes the picture overly shiny. In fact, it actually affects the tonal range of the picture. So let me show you another option that you might find helpful. This will help you if you want to work at a higher resolution for greater native detail, but still want thicker looking paint and texture. Now remember, you will need the Pro version of Rebelle 7 to be able to do this. So what we're going to do is make an overlay texture that makes the texture look thicker. This overlay texture is specific to your picture. It isn't just a generic texture that we are overlaying. And this will be the finished result. We have an overlay that, when enabled, makes the texture look much thicker. You can even adjust the opacity to vary the effect to get as much or as little enhancement as you want. So how do we do it? Well, the first step is to add a neutral grey layer above all the other layers. So we add a new layer at the top of the layer stack, select a mid-grey colour. It doesn't have to be perfect middle grey, but if you like to be specific, then the RGB value is 128, 128, 128, but anywhere close to that will do. Select the Fill tool and the Colour tab, and then fill that layer. You should be able to see the impasto texture through it. I add this into the base file so it is easy to repeat the whole export later if I subsequently edit the file. The second step is to save a temporary copy of the file. It's easier than trying to undo steps in a single file. So save the file with a suitable name, for example with -temp after the file name, and you will now be working in that new copy. For step 3, we're going to reduce the image pixel size, which we do from the menu with Edit Image Size. Make sure you don't select Edit Canvas Size, we need to change the image size. Decide if you're going to do a 2, 3 or 4 times nanopixel export. And you can experiment with all of these to see which works best. In this example, I'm going to use 3 times. In the canvas size window, make sure that you lock the aspect ratio. It should be highlighted blue. Pick one of the numbers and divide it by 3. Now, nobody's looking, so you can use a calculator if you need to. In this case, it is 1169 rounded down. 1170 would work fine as well. Because the aspect ratio is locked, when I change one number, the other will change in proportion as well. In this case, the image is square, so both numbers are the same anyway. You should see the image getting smaller as you type the numbers. Click on the tick mark or select OK at the bottom of the screen to apply the change to the image. The image is now 1/3 of the pixel size that it was. It will be lower resolution, but you should see that the textures now look thicker. The next step is to export the overlay. Now that we have the lower resolution version, if we enable the grayscale layer and enable nanopixel and set the impasto depth to about 5, the texture overlay should be ready to export. If it looks a little glossy at this point, don't worry, we'll fix that shortly. Use the nanopixel export to save the overlay file and select the scaling that you use to reduce the image. I used a factor of 3, so I will select 3:3 and save that as a JPEG file. If you look at the pixel size of that grayscale texture image that you've just saved, it will be the same as your original image, give or take a pixel or 2. We are done with the temporary image. You can save it if you want, and then move on to the next step, which is to apply the overlay texture. Simply reopen your original file using File, Open, Recent, or you can simply drag and drop the original Rebelle file into the window, whichever is easier. Now drag and drop the grayscale JPEG overlay texture onto your file and select New Layer. Because it is the same pixel size, it should just line up perfectly without needing to scale it or move it. Just click OK to accept this new layer. It should be at the top of the layer stack automatically, so you don't need to move it. Simply make sure it is enabled and then turn the layer blend method to overlay to apply the texture on top of your painting. If the blend mode is greyed out, unselect the colour pigments option next to it first. You should immediately notice that your texture is looking much thicker than before. The next step is to remove or reduce any glossiness. The Nanopixel export has created the gloss white highlights, which I certainly don't want for my image, so let's fix that. You might want to zoom into the picture very slightly and make sure you have some good thick texture visible that currently appears too glossy. Now go to the Filter menu and open the Curves filter. Make the window nice and big and move it so you can see your texture that you want to adjust. Make sure you have the RGB channel selected. It should be RGB by default. Most of the texture is grey, which is why there is a large spike in the middle of the curve. Now, we don't want to change the dark tones on the left, so what we need to do first is to add 3 points around the middle. Just click carefully on the diagonal white line to add the 3 points. This will anchor the midpoint. Now you can select the handle at the top right of the line and drag it down. You should see the gloss highlights fading out as you drag it down. The dark shadows shouldn't be changing. What we are doing is using the curve to remap white highlights to more of a neutral grey, which makes them less prominent. If you make the line horizontal, you will basically remove them completely. But don't take the line below halfway or you'll start to create confusing shadows where the highlights should be. I usually drag the line down to just above the midpoint, reducing but not completely eliminating the highlights. Once you're happy, click Apply. If you find that you haven't reduced the gloss as much as you wanted, you can always repeat this filter process at a later point. The next step is to balance the texture. If you only use the overlay texture, you may find that the image looks a bit soft as the shadows are a little bit blurry. I find that the best combination is to use some impasto texture blended with some overlay texture. So you're free to adjust the amount of impasto and the opacity of the overlay to get the best, thickest and sharpest looking texture that works for you. You may find that you want to push the impasto depth right up to 9 or 10 to make the texture really sharp and thick looking. But even with Nanopixel off and gloss set to 0, there might be some areas of the painting that now appear too shiny. If so, we can reduce the gloss further by using a second overlay. Set the impasto depth to what works, ignoring the gloss. Push the flat grey layer to the top and enable it. We do not need Nanopixel enabled this time as we're not upscaling this image, it is already the correct resolution. Just export the file as a JPEG. Keep the quality and size set to 100. And once it's saved, drag that JPEG image back in as a new layer. Again, disable the pigment if it is set and then set the blend mode to overlay. Now you can drop the impasto depth down to 0 and you should have a sharp, thick texture with a matte surface and no distracting glossiness. Now, ideally, you would do this once when your painting is completely finished. But you might find now that you have thicker texture, there are some bits that you would like to adjust. If you want to keep painting, then first of all, lock the overlay layers as it's very easy to paint on them by accident. You can use flat two-dimensional brushes or watercolour without any issue. They will add and blend to the paint without modifying the textures, so you can continue to experiment or refine your image. However, if you use impasto brushes, then they will obviously only affect the thinner impasto. They won't affect the overlay textures. So your image will get out of sync, so to speak. If you do add more impasto brushwork, then you can just repeat this whole process. When you're finished, remove the previous overlay texture and just do this process again to refresh the texture overlays. And if you're a perfectionist like me, you'll probably do it again and again, such as our curse. And then finally, we have metallics. Rebelle 7 introduced metallic paints. Now you'll find that these don't work if you try to have them under the texture overlay. They'll go matte. On the other hand, if you have them above the overlay, then they won't allow the underlying texture to come through. They'll look a little bit like they're just sitting above the textured surface. So my trick is to use metallic paint at the top and select a linear light blend mode. This will change the colour slightly, so you do need to adjust for that. but it allows the underlying texture to come through and makes the metallic sit on the image in a bit more of a convincing way. Hopefully in future versions of Rebelle we'll get better surface lighting options and layering options that better support impasto across multiple layers. But until then, hopefully these sorts of tricks can help you get the best, highest resolution images with the most convincing thick paint textures. What do you think? Does that help make images look more textured and convincing? Or do you have any useful tips that you can share? Let me know in the comments below. If you found that helpful, please do give the video a like. It is hugely appreciated. And if you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing. It really is a big help to my channel. So thanks for watching and hope to see you again next time.